Previously on the Seventh Valkyrie, the Winter's Festival erupts into chaos, with Strena and the Haven children caught up right nearby. But the Haven's protectors might have something to say about that, next on the Seventh Valkyrie. The whole beach kicked into a frenzy. Quicker than she'd thought possible, Ravi lifted Strena, placed her on the bench, and ignited, fire at his hands and barking directions to other men of shadows lingering around the beach. Any gifted warrior ignited, with green, blue, red, and even pale yellow lights, while others sprinted down the beach, some attending to Mama Maven and her friends in hushed tones, while others continued on, towards the children still playing by the surf. As Karis shepherded Strena over to Mama Maven, Strena asked and asked after what was going on, but got no reply. Still, despite Karis' calming words reassuring Strena, the young gifted girl couldn't help but overhear a phrase from Mama Maven and the other men of shadows. Family war. It was the only thing that made sense to Strena, who could still see many-colored flashes of ice, earth, flame, and water out across the pavilion. She'd sensed them in the night many times before, but they had never been this size and never at this intensity. The men of shadows were coming back with the children from the beach, who were chattering like startled sparrows, but they fell silent under the sharp, direct words of Mama Maven, who whipped them into their organized lines with a few sharp shouts and caring words. Then she led them, first to the little cut in the rocks where the children collected their shoes and coats, speaking clearly and urgently as the children helped each other get ready. Then, Mama Maven rounded them up and led them away from the festival, where the lights still flashed, even as the sounds had quieted somewhat. They were off to the Haven, Mama Maven explained, and they would talk more there. If it hadn't been for the phalanx of security guards and men of shadows, that trip might have seemed just like any other. They were closely knit together, watched over by Maven and other familiar faces from the Haven, and walked quickly along the beach towards the river, accompanied by the reassuring tune of strolling songs. But to Strena, who could still clearly sense the festival grounds, those steps further away from the square did not bring her peace. The power of the men of shadows hummed around them as they walked along the beach, but as bright as they shined, their light was dwarfed under the eruption of fear and fire and fighting along the waterfront. The people at the festival there weren't just scuffling. They were killing and dying and full of hate, a hate that seemed to be flowing out through the city along the roadways down to the river ahead of them. Wait, no. Strena checked her senses again, but everything seemed a little bit wrong. The hate wasn't flowing from the city. It was flowing into the city. Strena's eyes went alight as the front of their formation reached the alleys along the riverside, but she couldn't scream out in time before the first men were riddled with a storm of arrows erupting from down the street. Glows of fire and ice suddenly went dark, and with a chorus of shouting in three languages, the quiet streets along the riverfront came alive in a swarm of Edoran soldiers. In moments, they had broken onto the beach, sending the Haven children and their keepers all running, fleeing in something like a deadly game of wave chaser. There was screaming and flying arrows, and a wall of earth erupted to shield the children, fueled by the gifts of Boma and one of the men of shadows. Mama Maven cried out to the children to keep fleeing, to keep running along the beach. Behind them, the gifted among the men fought back in a stream of firebolts and ice, of stone and earth. The children screamed and ran, using the bought time, frantically herded and called after by Maven and the older women. But their time did not come without a price. Strena could sense the colorful lights behind her snuffed out in ones and twos. The Freelander men were slowly and steadily being overrun by the Edoran soldiers. Light-footed and fueled by fear, Strena quickly reached the front of the pack of small children racing back along the beach, calling after the other scared Haven children to encourage them as they retraced their path down along the water. Behind her, Strena could hear Maven calling out their new route. They would head back down to the waterfront, under the wharf, and out to... And then Maven's scream brought Strena to a stop. Many of the children had been in the Haven since longer than they could remember, and throughout all of it, Mama Maven had been an unwavering pillar of their lives. Always calm, always gentle, sometimes stern, but forever caring, and forever steady. That strangled cry of pain, anguish, and shock as Maven collapsed washed over the children, carrying with it the very essence of panic, and whatever lingering order they'd been clinging to melted, like sandcastles built too close to the sea. BC. She fell. Off the cliff and back up again. A moment trapped in eternity and replayed once every 7 seconds for the stadium crowd of none in a million. There was a heart-pounding triple-double undertime with the frantic buzz of killer hornets dancing among the loving eyes of the hated, trapped in time forever and flying no longer. And above all of it, the shards of the elements and elementals glittered and shined and splashed and screamed and ripped and tore and bled and shrieked and begged and died and died and died and fell and fell and fell, and the dragon had bucked its rider into the screaming kaleidoscope of the abyss. There were fingers that might have been hers yesterday, and they slipped through cloth, or maybe cloth slipped through fingers, or slipped fingered cloth, or the cloth tore, the fingers had never held anything in the first place, or the fingers had been all that held the world and now the world fell. She fell from falling, from the fall she fell until the world falling from the world falling from the world falling from the world was a dream of safe harbor, long turned into a nightmare. And when BC hit the ground, after 1,000 years of falling a moment later, she had fallen into a wavering war zone where winding flow of now and next had turned to wailing, winding whip water. The Machine King had struck, and BC was way too fucking high. 1,000 versions of BC had already rushed to their feet, climbing a mountain of the millions of her who had failed. And BC followed, climbing onto the knees and elbows and femurs of the versions of her that were currently failing. But the her that was her was still climbing onto a faceless swarm who were not her, and then she fell sideways between the faceless bodies and into a bad trip of jumbled memories and hellish reality. How could she have possibly known? Someone should have told her that she was going to need to run in her dancing shoes, especially when she had such clunky boots on her feet. Fortunately, her dress gave her a freedom to run that she would never have in a dress, so she was glad that she'd worn the pants she'd left behind before the recital. BC's long blonde hair filled her hair as she stumbled and caught herself on rough, tattooed hands, whose pristine nails and caramel skin had been sullied for the first time by angry, vanishing wounds that were there and then not there. It wasn't until she had gotten to her feet again, now surrounded by Edarin screaming in Uvera and Ancestran screaming in Aelish, that she was able to brush back her black locks from her blonde brow, break free from the crowd, and continue to run. And run and run and run. Every BC, all 2 of them, were running now in a human river sweeping along the splashing banks of the city, and she paddled to the top looking for air as she eddied and twisted and dipped beneath the surface and rose like a leaping bass. She needed to find her father because the Velvet Girls would need protection after all, and if she didn't find her mother, then the Edarin soldiers would be a lot of trouble. BC turned to fight so that she'd be able to run to hide, towering over 1,000-foot-tall faceless dancers, carrying her gently through screaming fields of flower. The racing sludge of the human river pulled at her, but with a lunge towards an infinite stairway, she tore free from the sticky, slimy slicks of humanity, and then she was climbing on all fours, dancing like bears on balls in the traveling circus coliseum fights. The flashing lights calmed only a moment as she broke free and BC breathed, flickering back to the present only long enough to confirm to both of herselves that they needed to fucking run, and so she cartwheeled and danced and ran and crawled along the stairs on a winding snake's back, legs screaming for joy as she swam up the hill. She was as heavy as a butterfly, flotsam in the breeze as she sought the forgiving darkness of an alleyway, hurling herself away from the lights and shrinking down, a million miles down as she curled up against the wall, panting and out of breath, sucking in air. The windows were ticking, ticking, ticking with the panic of inevitability, and she was tied and bound to the wall that had given her shelter. She was an experiment under malignant observation from the chaos just beyond the alleyway, which was waiting for the right time to manifest and devour her. And then the watcher she had feared distilled into a shadow in the alley, stepping with thunderous steps along the sound-swallowing candy cobblestones. BC pulled her dress up around her, blonde hair falling down around her shoulders as she desperately hid, compressing down into the corner like she could hide her sequined dancing shoes, or the sparkling gloss on her nails, or the ribbons in her hair. The shadow compressed and morphed and shifted again and took form, reaching out like a snake's fangs in a lion's jaw, and she slapped it away, screaming with all that she had. As the silence spilled out of her mouth, the shadow spun in for another pass, evolving into infinite splintering mechanical hands. BC closed her eyes in fear, but as she did, she felt the embrace of the void that she called Sin. The familiar power that had awakened in her all those years ago, and had made it so that she would never fear anyone again. Opening her eyes, BC stopped running and kicked out, and then rose with steady, glorious, detached power from where she had cowered, shoving back the dark figure. The darkness belonged to her, and with her next step she drew Sin, oblivion incarnate in the form of a graceful curving dueling blade, and brought it down with a motionless grace to cleave the stumbling figure in two. The motionless black eyes met terrified blue ones, and then in an instant made into a millennium by the half-dozen substances, BC flickered back into reality, face to face with Waver, gaze meeting his as Sin descended, hungering for blood. The blade fell and Waver screamed, collapsing to the ground. His deep blue eyes were frozen, pleading and afraid, and he thrashed as he slammed into the ground, spurting blood from what remained of his shoulder and right arm. Her stroke of midnight had erased it, struck it from existence like an artist's mistake. BC fell to her knees, pawing at him, begging him to respond, pleading with him as his twitching slowed. She called out for help over the chaos. Not Waver. Not Waver. No. Fuck anyone but Waver. Anyone but Waver. Her fear of Sin's power spiked, but she beat it back. And in a moment of desperation, she let Sin swallow the inconvenient feelings of fear, uncertainty, shame, like the nuisance that they were. A tingling black calmness settled around her, and BC tore off Waver's shirt. Letting Sin out into the living world again, she took another stroke of midnight and erased the rest of his arm. Then she tied the stump with a tourniquet and lifted the Sestran's moaning, barely conscious body onto her shoulder. Her eyes hummed black, and as she set off with purpose through the city torn to hell, her tattoos twisted ever tighter around her body, shown in their full deadly glory by her skimpy dress, coiled like pitch-scaled snakes ready to consume the world. Want to know what happens next? Join us on Patreon to become a hero of Edera and get early access to episodes along with bonus features, director's commentary, and the full Tab to archive. You can also find other ways to support us at the links in the description, and we will see you next week.